5 children, frozen, abandoned, and a dying baby girl taking her last breaths in the arms of a stranger, while her big sister held a knife to his throat. What kind of man keeps moving when cold steel kisses his jaw? What kind of little girl fights like that after everything's already been taken from her? And what kind of story ends with all of them saving each other? Stay with me. Every second of this one matters. This channel is home to the stories of the American West rugged cowboys with tender hearts, a mother's love that outlasts every storm, and the quiet, powerful bonds that form between broken people who find each other right when they need it most. Sometimes the person who saves you looks nothing like a hero, and sometimes you are the miracle someone else has been waiting for. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, do me a favor, hit that like button, drop your town in the comments, share this with someone who needs a reminder that goodness still exists, and subscribe so you never miss the moment when the lost ones finally find their way home.
It was the horse that stopped things. Silas gave the reins a tug, but old Buck set his feet in the snow like he'd grown roots. His ears were flat back, and he was blowing steam like a locomotive. "What's gotten into you, boy?" Buck stomped his hoof and jerked his head toward the trees. Silas pulled his Colt and peered into the white curtain of snow. Not a thing was moving. There was no sound but the wind, which screamed through the pines like a woman in grief. And that is when he saw it. A wagon. No team hitched up, no campfire, no light. Just a ghost of a wagon parked crooked on the trail while the snow tried to bury it. For a second, Silas thought about riding on by. He had learned a long time ago that getting into other folks' business was the quickest way to get into trouble of your own. He was down to $4 from the 12 he'd had. He had a bag of flour and some salt pork, and a 2-hour ride to get home in the meanest blizzard Wyoming had cooked up in 10 years. That was plenty of trouble for one man, but Buck refused to move. "Fine," Silas said, swinging down. He walked to that wagon with his pistol raised and his finger resting on the trigger. He took hold of the frozen tarp and yanked it clean off. 5 sets of eyes looked up at him. 5 children, huddled under one thin blanket that was more air than wool. The oldest was a girl with a big butcher knife clutched in her hand, pointed steady right at him. A boy behind her shielded the other 3, his arm out like a wing. "Get on away from us." The girl's voice was raspy and hurt, but that knife hand was rock solid. Silas put his Colt back in its holster and held up his hands so she could see them plain. "I'm not here to cause you any harm." That is what he said, too. "Who?" "The man who stole our horses and left us here to freeze." A cold stone dropped in Silas's stomach. "How long have y'all been out here?" "Since yesterday." 24 hours, in a wagon with no cover, in a Wyoming norther. He looked at the other children. A boy about 10 with his jaw set so hard you could see the bones in his cheeks. A little girl was rocking back and forth, holding a rag doll tight in her hands. Another boy with dark skin and dark hair watched Silas with old eyes that did not belong to a child. And there, cradled by the oldest girl, was the littlest one, maybe 4 years old. Her eyes were only halfway open. Her lips had a bluish tint, and her chest was barely rising. "She is dying," Silas stated plainly. The girl's knife jerked. "She is not. She is just cold." "That is not cold, little lady. That is a fever. How long has she been this way?" "She started shaking this morning. Then she just stopped and got real still." The girl's voice began to break, but she forced it steady. "She just needs to get warm." Silas made a move for the child. The knife shot up. "I told you, do not touch her." "You listen to me," Silas said, his voice low and calm. He held her gaze, talking to her like he would a frightened horse. "Easy now. Your sister is burning up from the inside out. I know this sickness. She needs a fire, warm water, and cloths on her chest. Without that, she has got about 4 hours left. You can stick me with that knife if it makes you feel better. But she will be gone before the sun goes down." The girl's tough expression shattered. It was like a crack appeared right down the middle of all her fight. And what was left was a 12-year-old girl who had been carrying the weight of the world for far too long. "You have a place?" she whispered. "A cabin? 2 hours north of here. It has a fire and 4 walls." "You live by yourself?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because everybody I ever loved is gone." The girl just looked at him. Whatever she read in his weathered face seemed to be answer enough because she lowered the knife. Not completely, but enough. "I am Hannah. Hannah Ruth Dawson." She tilted her head toward the others. "That is my brother Sam, my sister Clara, and my sister Nettie." She looked at the dark-haired boy. "And this is Joe. He is not our blood, but he is our family." "Silas Mallister, we can finish the pleasantries after your sister is not knocking on death's door. Can you walk?" "We all can, except for Nettie." "Then let us get to moving." Hannah bundled Nettie in the tattered blanket and offered her to him. Silas took the child, and the heat that came off her little body felt like a hot stone from a campfire. She was light as a feather, just bones and fever, with a heart that beat against his ribs like a panicked little bird. He unbuttoned his heavy coat and tucked her inside, right up against his skin. Her little head rested on his shoulder, and her fingers, as delicate as a moth's wings, twisted into his shirt and held on tight. Something broke loose inside Silas's chest. A place he had boarded up 6 years ago when he stood over 2 fresh graves and swore he would never again hold anything so small and fragile. "Do not you die on me, little one," he murmured to the child. "You hear me? Do not you dare." He looked at the others. "Sam, can you ride a horse?" The boy's jaw was still tight, but he gave a single nod. When he answered, his words came out choppy. "Yes, sir, I can." "Good. You climb on. Clara will sit in front of you. Joe, you get on behind. Hannah, you will walk with me." Sam was the first to move. He carefully lifted Clara out of the wagon. The little girl kept one hand on her worn-out doll and the other on her brother's coat. "Rosie is afraid," Clara whispered. "You tell Rosie I have got her," Sam answered. He swung himself onto Buck's broad back and pulled Clara up. He wrapped his arms around her, steady and strong. The boy might have a hitch in his speech, but his hands were sure. You could tell those hands had been holding his world together for a good long while. Joe mounted up behind Sam without saying a thing. He was quiet and graceful as smoke, settling onto the horse like he was born there. His right hand came to rest on the bone-handled knife he wore. It was Cheyenne steel, his mother's knife. "You have ridden before?" Silas asked. "My mother's people ride. We do not walk." "Good. Keep them both steady. This trail is going to get rough." Joe just lifted his chin and gave one sharp nod. He did not waste a single word. That just left Hannah. She was standing in the snow, her boots soaked clear through, with that big knife now pushed into her belt. She glanced back at the wagon one last time, at all the things they were leaving behind. Then her eyes met Silas's. "If this is some kind of trick, I need you to know that I will make you regret it. It does not matter that I am small. It does not matter how many years it takes. It is not a trick." "Then let us go. My sister is running out of time." They set off into the heart of the storm. Silas went first, his boots breaking a path through the deep snow. Hannah followed right in his footsteps to save her energy. She was smart. It was the kind of smart you only learn the hard way when you figure out that every wasted movement can be your last. Nettie was a furnace against his chest. Every so often, Silas would stop and listen to her breathing. It was still there, shallow and rattly, but it was there. "Tell me about the man who did this to you," Silas said. Hannah was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely empty of feeling. It was the way people sound when the hurt is too big to let out, so they just wall it off and talk around it. His name is Victor Crane. He came and found us after our mama passed. He said the law made him our guardian since we were orphans. He had papers with seals on them and everything. What happened to your parents? Pa was killed by bandits outside of Cheyenne. They took $14 and his boots. That is all my father's life was worth. She stopped for a breath. Mama held on for 3 more weeks, then the fever got her. She died holding Nettie's hand. Nettie has not said a single word since that day. Silas glanced down at the silent child he held. She was not born unable to speak. She was silenced by sorrow. A 4-year-old girl who watched her mother leave this world and then decided this world was not worth speaking to anymore. Crane appeared 2 days after Mama was gone, Hannah went on. He was full of smiles and big promises, said he ran a special home for children, that we would be looked after. But Joe heard him talking to another man that first night. He was talking about how much a child could bring at the mining camps, and how the little ones were useful for tight spaces in the shafts. He knew the hurt ones and the shy ones fetched a lower price since no one would bother to fight over them. Silas's knuckles went white around Buck's reins, the leather biting into his hand. He keeps a book, Hannah explained. It is bound in black leather just like his coat. He put all our names in it, and beside each name, he put a price. I saw my own, $40. Clara was 30. Sam's was only 20 on account of his stutter. Joe was 15 because his pa was an Indian. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Nettie's was $5. That is what he decided my sister's life was worth. A little girl who can't speak and can't do a lick of work. $5 or just leave her by the road to save on feed. Silas stopped his horse. The snow came down around them, heavy and quiet. For a long moment, all you could hear was the wind and the rattling sound of Nettie's every breath. He is not getting a single one of you, Silas said, his voice low and steady. Hannah looked up at him, her eyes full of doubt. You do not even know who we are. I know enough. What do you know? That we are 5 more mouths you cannot possibly feed. That a man named Crane has papers that say the law is on his side. That taking us in will make you a dead man. I know your sister is worth more than $5. I know your brother holds this family together and he is just 10 years old. I know that boy on the horse carries his mother's knife because it is the only piece of home he has left. And I know you have been fighting since the day your father died, and you have not stopped for a single second. Hannah's eyes welled up with tears. She blinked once, then twice, fighting them back before turning to walk on. They moved through the snow in silence for a good long while. The storm seemed to press down on them from all sides, and the air got colder as the light began to fail. Clara's little voice floated back from atop the horse. I am cold, and Rosie is cold too. We are almost there, sweetheart. You keep on saying that. Because it keeps on being true. Sam's voice followed, a little stronger now. Silas. Joe says this storm has another 2 days left in it. Silas glanced back at the boy. How can you tell? The wind turned, coming from the northwest now, and the snow is turning finer. My mother could read a storm like your people read the time on a clock. Joe took a breath, and she was never wrong. Then we had better pick up the pace. The cabin appeared through the snow like something from a dream. Its dark walls stood out against the white land. A thin line of smoke still curled from the chimney, a ghost of the morning's fire. Silas thought he had never been happier to see that sorry pile of logs in all his born days. That is it? Clara asked from the horse. That is it. It is awfully small. It is also awfully warm. He carried Nettie inside first, setting her down on the bed nearest the fireplace. He tossed more wood onto the embers and knelt to blow them back into a climbing fire. Hannah was right there behind him. Water bucket is by the door. I need a cloth. The chest in the corner has cotton shirts. Just rip up what you need. Hannah moved as if she had done this about 1,000 times before. She found the shirts, tore them into clean strips, then filled a pot with water and hung it to warm over the fire. Her hands were steady as a rock. Her face showed nothing at all. She had put everything she was feeling behind some iron wall deep inside her and just got to the work. She carefully peeled away Nettie's damp clothes and laid a warm, wet cloth on the little girl's chest. Nettie's eyelids fluttered open for a second. Her small hands shot out and took hold of Hannah's wrist. She did not squeeze, she just held on. Even burning up with a fever, even floating somewhere between this world and whatever comes next, she was reaching for her sister. "I am here," Hannah whispered. "I am right here with you, Nettie. I am not going anywhere." Sam helped Clara inside. The little girl was shaking so hard from the cold that her teeth chattered, making it hard to talk, so she just held up her doll and made its little arm wave hello to the room. Sam looked at the door, then the window, then checked every corner. He was mapping out all the ways out, every shadow, every place a danger could hide, just like a soldier clearing a room. He was 10 years old and already built for a fight. "All secure," he said under his breath, and then looked a bit ashamed. "You are a good man," Silas told him. "Barnes is outside. The horse needs some grain. Second stall on the left." Sam stood up a little taller. "Yes, sir." He walked out into the storm without a moment's pause. Joe was the last one in. He shut the door and leaned his back against it, then pulled his knife and sat down. His eyes scanned the room one time. Then they locked on Silas, watching him, taking his measure. "You plan on sitting there all night?" Silas asked him. "Somebody needs to watch the door. You are 9 years old. My mother killed a wolf when she was 9. Age is not what matters. Being ready is what matters." Silas looked at this boy, a child of two worlds who was not wanted in either one. He had Cheyenne blood and white blood flowing in his veins, and both his peoples had turned their backs on him. He had been cast aside by everyone who should have called him their own. And yet here he was, still standing, still ready to fight, still keeping watch over a door. "Your mother sounds like a woman I would have liked to know." Joe's grip tightened on the handle of his knife. "She was the strongest person who ever walked this earth." "I believe you." Something in Joe's expression changed. It was not trust, not by a long shot, but it was a small crack in his defenses. It was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, this strange white man was different from all the others who had ever looked at Joe and saw something less than a boy. Silas put a pot of beans and salt pork on the fire to heat. It was not nearly enough food for 6 people. It was not even close, but it was hot, and at that moment hot was the only thing standing between living and dying. Clara sat on the floor by the fire, hugging her doll tight. "Rosie wants to know if we get to stay here." "What does Clara want to know?" The little girl peeked at him over her doll's head. "The same thing. You are staying here tonight. That is the only promise I can make you. Sam says that promises are just the words people say right before they leave you." The little girl's words hit Silas like a kick from a mule. He got down on one knee to be at her level. "Sam has been let down by the wrong kind of people, and so have you. I cannot fix what is already broken. But I can tell you this much. Tonight, you are going to eat. Tonight, you are going to be warm. And tonight, nobody is going to come through that door who means to do you any harm. What about tomorrow? Tomorrow, I will tell you the very same thing." Clara took a moment to think on this. Then she held up her doll. "Rosie says okay." Rosie is a smart girl. They ate their meal. Silas took the smallest share for himself, and nobody said a word because Hannah saw what he did and understood, and the other children followed her example. Sam came in from the barn smelling of hay and horse, and he sat down close to his sisters. He ate using only one hand. The other hand he kept resting on Clara's shoulder. "That horse, Buck, he pushed his nose right up against my chest," Sam said. "He just stood there, breathing warm on me. Nothing has ever been that gentle with me before. He's a good horse. He's better than most folks, most days anyway." "Yeah." When they finished, Hannah changed the cloths on Nettie's chest. The fever was still there. It had not gone up, but it had not broken either. The child's fingers were still wrapped around Hannah's wrist. It was a tiny anchor holding her between life and letting go. She needs a doctor, Hannah said softly. The nearest doctor is in Elk Creek, a good 10 miles away. We cannot ride there in this storm. So we wait. We keep changing the compresses. We keep her warm. Silas sat back down in his chair and looked over at Hannah. You have done this before. My mama got sick 3 times when we were on the trail. I nursed her back to health 2 of those times. Hannah's voice was flat without any feeling. The 3rd time, nothing I did was good enough. That is not your fault, I know that. But the way she said it, he knew she did not believe it at all. Not in the place deep down where it counts. The cabin grew quiet. There was just the sound of the fire crackling, the wind howling outside, and Nettie's labored breathing. Joe sat with his back to the door, his knife lying across his lap, his eyes wide open, watching. Sam was lying on the floor with Clara curled up beside him. The little girl was holding her doll up to her ear. Rosie says she can hear the wind talking. What is it saying? She says it is telling us that we are going to be okay. Well, then it must be true. Clara's eyes drifted shut. A few minutes later, she was sound asleep. Sam stayed awake a little longer, his hand never leaving her shoulder, his gaze shifting from the door to the window and back again. Then he, too, finally fell asleep. Hannah sat on the floor right next to Nettie's bed. She had not stopped moving since the moment they arrived. She had not rested. She had not let that wall around her come down. She had not let herself be a 12-year-old girl. She looked at Silas, and in the warm firelight, he could finally see the bone-deep weariness she had been hiding. You can sleep now, he told her. I cannot. Why not? Because if I close my eyes, I will just wake up and find out this is all another lie. I will wake up to another man who said we were safe but meant something else entirely. I mean, safe. Then prove it. How? Hannah reached down and picked up her knife from where it lay on the floorboards. She offered it to him, handle first. Take it. If you are who? If you claim to be, you do not need me to be unarmed to feel safe. And if you are not who you claim to be, then I have just handed you the only weapon I had. Silas looked from the knife to Hannah's tired face. He reached out his hand and gently pushed the blade back towards her. You keep it. A girl your age ought to always have a knife, especially when she is around men she does not know yet. Hannah's chin quivered, just for a second. She caught it and held it still. But that one little shake told him more than any amount of tears ever could. She slipped the knife back into her belt. My mama would have liked you, she said. I reckon I would have liked her too. Anybody who could raise a girl like you had to be somebody special. Hannah turned back to watch over Nettie, and for the first time since he had found them, Silas saw her shoulders relax. It was just a little bit, just enough to let him know that a small piece of the heavy load she carried had been shifted. It was not gone, not yet, but now it was shared. Silas did not go to sleep. He sat there in his chair with his Colt revolver across his lap and watched the fire burn low. Then he would build it back up and watch it burn low again. Sometime around 2 in the morning, Nettie's breathing changed. It became easier and much smoother. That wet, rattling sound started to fade away. Her grip on Hannah's wrist loosened as her small body finally sank into a real, peaceful sleep. The fever is easing up, Hannah said, and for the first time all night her voice trembled. She is a tough one. She is all I have got. That is not true anymore. Hannah did not answer him, but she did not try to argue either. At 3 in the morning, Clara suddenly woke up screaming. It was not words, just a pure animal sound of fear that echoed in the small cabin. It brought Joe to his feet with his knife out and Sam sitting straight up with his hands balled into fists. Clara was on the floor, her eyes wide with terror, staring at something none of them could see. The man, she choked out. The man with the black coat. He is on his way. He is coming to get us. Silas moved to her side and knelt. There is nobody here, Clara. It is just us. He is coming. He always comes back. He wrote down our names in his book and said he could find us anywhere we went. Then let him come, Silas said. his voice as low and solid as the earth. "Let him come right to that door. He is about to find out what happens when someone tries to take what is mine." Clara's frantic gaze locked onto his. "You would fight him?" "Sweetheart," he said, "I would walk through fire for any of you. And I have been through the fire before. The devil himself knows who I am." Clara scrambled into his lap. She buried her face in his chest and threw her arms around his neck. And Silas held her, just like he used to hold his Lily when the thunder would rattle their little home, and the world seemed too big and cruel for a little girl. "Tell Rosie," Clara whispered against his shirt. "We're going to be all right, Rosie, I promise." Sam watched from his bedroll. His jaw was clenched and his fists were still tight, but there was a wetness in his eyes. He swiped at it quickly, hoping no one had noticed. Joe noticed. And Joe looked away, letting the boy keep his pride. Clara finally drifted off to sleep in his arms. Silas. He carried her back to Sam and set her down real gentle-like. Sam just gathered her up, not saying a word. In the darkness, his hand found hers and he held on tight. Joe eased himself back against the door frame. Across the flickering fire, his eyes locked with Silas's. "You meant all that, didn't you?" Joe asked quietly. "What you told her?" "Every last word. My own mother used to say, you can know a man's true character by seeing what he does when he thinks no one is looking. She said, the ones that are kind to little ones and animals, those are the men you can trust." Joe let out a slow breath. She also said, "Trust ain't built in a day. Your mother was a wise woman. She usually was." Joe rested his head back on the wood. The hand on his knife loosened just a bit, and for the first time since they'd gotten there, he let his eyes close. Silas sat in the quiet dark, listening to the sound of 5 children breathing under his roof. The littlest one's fever was finally breaking. The oldest one was starting to let her guard down. There was a boy who stammered but had a grip like iron. A girl who talked to her doll 'cause the world was too big and scary to face alone. And then there was the boy holding his dead mother's knife and carrying her wisdom, refusing to let go of either one. 5 children he had no way to care for. 5 more mouths than he could possibly feed. 5 lives that painted a big old target on his back for every crooked lawman and child peddler in the territory. Catherine, she would have welcomed them in without a second thought. She'd have had 'em fed, warm, and giggling inside of an hour. She would have known just the right thing to do, just the right thing to say. How to make 5 broken little souls feel whole again. Catherine had always been the strong one. Silas had just been the fella fortunate enough to stand beside her. He glanced out the window at the 2 graves, now covered in snow, just white shapes in the gloom. For 6 years he'd been dying in this cabin. 6 long years of drawing breath without really living, of eating without tasting a thing, of waking up each morning and wondering what the point was. Now he finally knew why. It wasn't because he was owed some second chance. He didn't believe in such things. It was because 5 children were freezing to death out on a trail, and somebody had to do something. Somebody had to be the man who didn't just ride on by. And whether it was God or destiny or just plain dumb luck, Silas Mallister had been on that trail at that very moment, and his horse had planted its feet and refused to budge. So here he was, and here they all were. The fire was getting low, the blizzard howled outside, and somewhere in the distance a man named Victor Crane was likely sitting in a warm saloon. He'd be going through a black leather book, adding up what 5 missing children were worth to the kind of men who paid him. Crane would come looking. Silas knew that for a fact. Men who trafficked in children didn't just forget about their investments. He would show up with official papers and shiny badges, and every weapon the law gives a man who knows how to twist it. Well, let him come. Silas checked his Colt pistol. 6 rounds in the cylinder and a box of 20 more tucked away in his saddlebag. His hands didn't shake. His mind was sharp, and for the first time in 6 long years, he had something in this world worth defending. He scooted his chair a little closer to the fire and settled in for the long, dark hours until the sun came up. Tomorrow, that storm would still be howling. Tomorrow, he would have to figure out how to feed 6 people with only $4. Tomorrow, word would get out all over the territory that a broken-down rancher had taken in 5 orphans, and every bit of trouble that could come from that would start heading straight for his door. But all that was for tomorrow. Tonight, these children were warm. Tonight, they were safe. Tonight, a 4-year-old girl's fever was finally breaking. A 12-year-old girl had put her knife aside. A boy who never showed weakness had let himself cry. And another boy had closed his eyes, putting his trust in a stranger to watch the door. And tonight, inside a cabin that had felt like a tomb for 6 years, Silas Mallister heard a sound he figured he'd never hear again. It was the sound of children breathing while they slept. It sounded like the whole world was beginning fresh. The storm kept on for 2 whole days, exactly like Joe figured it would. Silas made the beans and salt pork stretch, dividing everything 6 ways into tiny portions. He'd lie about already having eaten whenever Hannah caught him skipping a meal. "You haven't touched your plate," Hannah pointed out on the second morning. "I ate before you all woke up." "No, you didn't," she said flatly. "The pot is just as full as it was last night. Are you keeping tabs on my supplies now? Well, somebody's got to. You'll waste away trying to feed us, and what good will that do? A dead man ain't no help to nobody." Silas just looked at this girl who was far too clever for her own good and carried the weight of someone much older, and carried herself like someone twice her age. "Eat your breakfast, Hannah. You eat yours first." They just stared at one another across the little cabin. Sam watched them from his corner, chewing his food real slow, trying to disappear the way kids do when the grown-ups get worked up. Clara held up her doll. "Rosie thinks you both ought to eat." Silas finally took a spoonful of beans. Hannah did the same. Neither one of them broke their gaze. "Stubborn old man," Hannah grumbled under her breath. "Stubborn young lady. I get it from my mama." "She taught you right." Ned's fever finally broke that second night. She opened her eyes and looked around the cabin as if she'd never seen a roof over her head before. Hannah was right there in an instant, feeling her forehead, checking her breath, taking her pulse just the way their mother must have showed her. "She feels cool, Silas. Her skin is cool." Silas walked over to the bed and gently laid his hand on Ned's forehead. The burning heat was gone. All that was left was cool, damp skin and a faint pulse, but it was steady. The little girl looked up at him with gray eyes that seemed to hold nothing at all. Not fear, not relief, just a wide-open emptiness where a 4-year-old's world was supposed to be. "Hey there, Nettie," he said, his voice soft. "It's good to have you back." Nettie just stared. Her little mouth didn't move. Her face didn't change one bit, but her hand snuck out from under the blanket. It found his finger, and she just held on. Hannah let out a tiny sound, a little choked-off noise that she quickly swallowed, a little gasp that she caught before it could turn into a real cry. "She hasn't reached out for anybody since Mama passed, not even for me." "Well, she's reaching now. But why you? She doesn't even know who you are." Silas didn't have a good answer for that. He just sat there, feeling the grip of a silent child on his finger, as she stared at him with eyes that had seen too much and had decided they were done looking. After a little while, Ned's hold loosened, and she drifted back to sleep. This time it was a real sleep, the kind that mends you instead of just wearing you out. On the third morning, the storm finally gave up. Joe had called it an hour before sunrise. "Wind's changing," he'd said. "Sun'll be out by noon." By the middle of the morning, the sky broke open, clear and cold blue. Snow was piled 3 feet deep all across the valley, so bright and glittering it hurt your eyes to look at it. Silas stood in the doorway doing some hard math in his head that he didn't much like. $4? 6 mouths to feed? A little girl who needed a doctor, and 5 children who needed just about everything he didn't have. "I've got to ride into Elk Creek," he told Hannah. "It's a town about 10 miles south. We need supplies, and Nettie needs Doc Harlan to take a look at her." Hannah's face got all stiff. "You're leaving us?" "I'm just going to town. There's a big difference." "Is there, though? I'll be back before it gets dark." That's what Pa said when he left for Cheyenne to sell the horses. He never came back either. Your Pa ran into road agents. I'm just riding to a general store. And what if Crane is there? That name just hung in the air between them. Silas had been thinking. For 2 whole days, Silas could not get the man named Crane out of his head. He kept turning the thought of him over and over, like a rock you find that is too heavy to carry but too strange to leave behind. This was a man who kept a black leather book, writing down children's names right next to dollar signs. A man who had left 5 little ones to freeze in a blizzard, calling them nothing more than damaged goods. Silas told himself, if Crane is in that town, it is his own problem, not mine. But Hannah's voice cut through his thoughts. "Take Joe with you," she had said. Joe, who was sitting quietly and cleaning his knife, looked up. "I will go." Silas looked at the boy. "You are only 9. But Joe's voice was steady. "And I have traveled more miles than most men in this whole territory. I know how to watch a road. I know how to see trouble long before it ever sees you." Joe slid his knife back into its sheath. "My mother always said 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, and she never rode anywhere by herself." Silas looked at the boy for a long moment. Beneath that tough talk and carefully chosen words, Joe was asking for something more than just a ride to town. He was asking to be trusted. He was asking to be seen as a man, not as the half-breed child the world had already written off. "Go saddle up," Silas said, and Joe was moving before the words were even fully spoken. As he prepared, Hannah pulled Silas to the side where no one else could hear. "If something happens to you out on that road, what are we supposed to do?" "Nothing is going to happen. Answer the question, Silas." He reached into a wooden chest and took out a folded piece of paper. "My neighbor's name is Thomas Kincaid. The old Tom Ranch is 3 miles northeast of here. Just follow the creek. This paper has his name on it. If you can get to him, he will help you all." "You trust him with my life?" "That is your life. I am asking about ours." "With your lives, too," he said quietly. Hannah took the paper. She did not even look at it, just folded it carefully and tucked it inside her dress, close to her skin. "Be back before it gets dark." "I will." "Promise me." "I promise." "I am choosing to believe you," she said. "Do not make me regret it." Silas and Joe rode out under a sky so blue it looked like it had been painted on. The fresh snow crunched under the horses' hooves. Joe sat straight and tall behind Silas, with his knife on his belt and his eyes constantly moving, scanning the line of trees, the high ridges, and the long trails stretching out behind them. "Are you always this watchful?" Silas finally asked. "You stay alive a whole lot longer when you pay attention," Joe answered. "That is a fair point." They rode on without speaking for a good while. The mountains rose up all around them, huge and white, and the trail was a narrow path cut through deep snowdrifts that their horse Buck pushed through with the kind of patience that comes from having seen much worse. "Silas." "Yeah." "In town," Joe started, "when people see me, they're going to have their opinions. People always have opinions about my blood, about my mother's people. In most towns I have been through, they look at me like I'm something they need to scrape off the bottom of their boots." Silas turned around in his saddle to look the boy right in the eye. "What do you want me to do about it?" "Nothing. I can handle it myself. Just do not pretend like it is not happening. My mother used to say the worst kind of white man is not the one who hates you right to your face. It is the one who watches it all happen and just acts like he does not see a thing. Your mother was a wise woman. She was the wisest person I ever knew." Then here is what I will tell you, Silas said. Ato, anyone in that town who even looks at you the wrong way, they will have to answer to me. Not because you cannot handle yourself, but because you should not have to. Not while you are riding with me. Joe was quiet for a long, long time after that. Then he said, his voice barely a whisper, "My father was a white man. He told my mother he loved her. Then he left before I was born, and he never once came back. Every white man I have met since then has been some kind of version of him. Always saying one thing but doing another. Well, I am not your father." "No," Joe agreed, pausing for a moment. "You are not. You are something I have not quite figured out yet." "Take your time," Silas said. Elk Creek finally appeared around a wide bend in the trail. A small group of buildings was huddled together down in a valley, looking like they were all trying to keep each other warm. Main Street, if you could call it that, had a general store, a saloon, a church with a steeple that leaned a little to the east, a sheriff's office, and a livery stable. There were maybe 40 buildings in all, and most of them looked like they would just give up and fall down if the wind blew hard enough. Silas tied Buck to a post outside the general store and pushed open the door. The warmth inside hit him like a solid wall. A pot-belly stove glowed bright red in the middle of the room, and shelves lined every single surface, packed tight with cans and bolts of cloth and tools, and just about everything else a little frontier town needed to pretend it was civilized. Behind the counter stood a woman, maybe 58 or 60 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that did not miss a single thing. Margaret Holloway. Folks just called her Maggie. She had run this store ever since her husband passed on 8 years ago, and everyone knew she ran it better than he ever did. "Silas Mallister. I've not seen you since last October." "Been busy." "Busy dying of loneliness from what I hear," she said plainly. Maggie's eyes then shifted over to Joe, who was standing just inside the doorway. She looked at the boy the same way she looked at everything, straight on, without a bit of flinching. "And who is this?" "Joe. He is with me." "I can see that. Are you hungry, Joe?" Joe blinked his eyes. Whatever he had been expecting when he walked into a white woman's store, it certainly was not that. "Yes, ma'am." Maggie reached into a tin behind the counter, pulled out a big biscuit and held it out to him. "Fresh this morning. Do not you tell me you are too proud to eat." "Pride is a luxury," Joe said, "and biscuits are a necessity." He took the biscuit from her hand. "Thank you, ma'am." "Thank you." "Polite, too. Got better manners than half the grown men in this town." She turned her attention back to Silas. "Now, what is it you need?" "Everything." Silas pulled the $4 from his coat pocket. "This is all I have got. That will buy you about a week's worth of food if we stretch it thin." "I need it to last a month," Silas said. "And I need enough for 6 people." Maggie's eyebrows shot straight up. "6? Since when are there 6 of you?" So Silas told her. Not the whole story, but just enough. He told her about the 5 children left behind in a wagon, about a man named Crane who seemed to be in the business of selling kids, and about a 4-year-old girl with a fever that had finally broken. Maggie listened to the whole thing without saying a word. When he was finished, she came around from behind the counter and started pulling things down from the shelves. Flour, beans, coffee, salt. Thick slab of bacon, canned peaches, a bag of sugar, 2 warm blankets, and a whole bolt of cloth for making new clothes. "Maggie, that is a whole lot more than $4 worth." "I know exactly what it is worth. I cannot pay for all of that." "Did I ask you to?" She just kept right on stacking items on the counter. "My husband and I, we never had any children of our own. Always wanted them. But God had other plans. If there are 5 children who need feeding, then I am going to feed them. You can pay me back whenever you can. And if you cannot, then you will consider it a gift, and you will accept it like a man who knows when it is time to say thank you." Silas opened his mouth to argue, but then he just closed it. "Thank you, Maggie. That is better. Now this man Crane, does Sheriff Cross know anything about him? I have not spoken to Cross yet. Maggie's expression changed then. Something careful and quiet moved behind her eyes. You'll be cautious with Reuben Cross. He is not a bad man, but he is not a brave one either. And men who are not brave have a bad habit of leaning toward whoever is paying them the most. You think he has been bought? I think he's an expensive man to keep happy, she said. And I think there are people in this territory who can afford him. She finished stacking up all the supplies and looked him right in the eye. You are going to need more than $4 and a good heart to keep those children safe, Silas. You're going to need to have the law on your side, or at the very least, not have it working against you. You know a lawyer? I know a reverend, Elijah Pope. He lost his arm at Shiloh and found God in a hospital tent. He is a hard man, and he is a fair man, and he does not scare easy. You go talk to him. I will. Silas loaded all the supplies onto Buck's back while Joe stood watch. The boy had not relaxed for 1 second since they had ridden into town. His eyes followed every face and every movement, cataloging all the possible threats, just the way his mother's people had been doing for generations. They were just crossing the street when a voice stopped them cold. Mallister. Silas turned. Sheriff Reuben Cross was standing on the porch of his office. He was a big man with a belly that told of easy living and a badge that told of an authority he might not have earned. He was about 50, with a red face, and he was holding a cup of coffee like he had been waiting for them. Sheriff, I heard you rode in with a boy. Cross looked over at Joe, then looked away, then looked back again. Indian half, Joe said before Silas could even answer. His chin was held high, his hand was resting on the handle of his knife. I did not ask you, boy. He is with me, Silas said, his voice firm. I can see that. The question is, why? And while we are on the subject of questions, I hear you picked up some strays out there during the storm. 5 children, no parents. Is that true? Word traveled fast in a small town, a whole lot faster than Silas liked. I found 5 kids in a wagon. They were abandoned. I brought them to my place. That is a lot of mouths to feed for a man who can barely feed himself. That is my business. It becomes my business when children are involved. Territorial law says that orphans go to authorized guardians or to institutions, not to single men living all alone on a failing ranch. Territorial law also says you cannot sell children to the mining operations, but I hear that happens plenty in this territory. The sheriff's face went from red to a pale white. Cross set his coffee down real slow. He said, That is a powerful accusation. Silas just looked at him. It's a powerful world. He stepped in a little closer and dropped his voice down low. Now you listen to me, Mallister. I do not know what tall tales you have been hearing, but some folks in this territory have long reaches and short fuses. They are people who do not appreciate ranchers trying to be heroes. The smartest thing you could do is turn those children over to the proper authorities and get back to your cows. Silas asked, And who are the proper authorities? Are they you? Is it some judge I have not laid eyes on? Or is it a fella named Victor Crane who jots down children's names in a book right next to a price? Cross flinched. It was a tiny thing, gone in a flash, and he covered it up pretty good. But Silas saw it, and the boy Joe saw it, and both of them filed that little detail away. I do not know any Victor Crane, Cross said. Silas replied, That is funny, because this Victor Crane fellow seems to know exactly how things get done around here. Cross let his hand fall to his belt. It was not for his gun, just the belt itself. But that simple move said everything. This talk is finished. You keep those kids if you are set on it. But when the official papers find you, do not say I did not give you a fair warning. Silas just tipped his hat. I appreciate the concern, Sheriff. He walked Buck on down the street, with Joe walking right alongside him. The boy kept quiet until they were well out of town. Then he said, He is telling a lie. Silas nodded. I know. He knows that Crane fella. When you said his name, the man's left eye twitched. He shifted his weight back onto his heel. My mother taught me how to read people just like I read the sky for weather. What other signs did you read? Silas asked. He is scared. But he is not scared of you. He is scared of whoever Crane answers to, somebody higher up, somebody who can make a small-town sheriff real nervous. A judge, maybe, or someone with true power. So, what do? Joe asked. We are going home. We will get some food in those kids and map out our next move before they can map out theirs. The journey back home stretched on for 2 hours. The sun was already starting to dip below the mountains by the time they spotted the cabin. A little curl of smoke rose from the chimney. Buck seemed to know they were home and picked up his speed. Hannah had the door open before Silas even had a chance to get to it. Her eyes scanned the two riders, saw they were both in one piece, and you could see some of the worry just melt off her shoulders. You are back, she said. I told you I would be. And we have supplies, more than what we paid for. The lady at the general store just would not take no for an answer. Hannah started helping unload as little Clara bounced all around the cabin. She looked at every single item like it was Christmas morning. Peaches, Rosie, look! Peaches right here in a can. She clutched the tin can to her chest. Can we please have some tonight? After supper, Silas told her. Clara pouted. Rosie says after supper is too long to wait. Rosie can wait, he said with a small smile. Sam was standing over by the fire, just watching them pile up all the food. His jaw was tight. You could see the words getting stuck behind his teeth. That is a lot of food. It is enough to last us a while, Silas said. Sam looked him straight in the eye. You did not steal it, did you? No. People do not just give things away. Not to folks they do not know. Well, Maggie Holloway does. Sam thought about this for a moment. He filed it away with all the other new pieces of information he was gathering about a world that had only ever shown him its cruel side, and now might just be trying to make things right. Okay, he said after a while. Just that one word, okay? It was a single, small step towards believing that maybe kindness did not always have a hidden cost. That evening, they had the best meal they had eaten since they had arrived. There was bacon and beans and fresh cornbread, with those canned peaches for dessert. Clara ate her peaches slice by single slice, holding each one up for her doll Rosie to see before she popped it into her mouth. Sam ate with a steady, careful pace, just like he did everything else. Joe ate quickly and cleaned his plate, leaving nothing behind. Hannah waited until everyone else was done before she ate. She checked the pot to make sure there was enough left before she served herself. That is a mother's habit. The one who always eats last, just to be sure her family has enough. Sit down and eat, Hannah, Silas told her gently. There is plenty. I am eating. No, you are managing things. There is a difference. Sit down. Just be a kid for 5 minutes. Hannah looked at him like he had just started speaking a different language. Be a kid. She probably could not even remember what that felt like. She was 12 years old, with the hands of a mother and the eyes of a soldier, carrying a burden on her small shoulders that would have crushed most grown men. But she sat, and she ate. And for just those 5 minutes, the walls she kept up crumbled down, and she was just a hungry girl enjoying peaches by the fire. After they finished eating, Silas told them all about his meeting with Sheriff Cross. He did not soften the story. These children had been fed enough lies in their lives. They had earned the right to hear the truth, no matter how ugly it was. The sheriff, he knows Crane, Silas explained. Or at the very least, he knows somebody who is connected to Crane. Either way you slice it, he is not on our side. So what do we do now? Hannah asked, her voice steady. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to ride back into town. I will talk with Reverend Pope at the church. I'm going to see if he can help us get legal standing. Legal standing for what? She asked. To keep you. The little cabin fell completely silent. 5 pairs of young eyes were fixed right on him. Sam's mouth opened to speak, but then it closed again. Clara hugged her doll, Rosie, even tighter. Joe's hand, which was never far from his knife, went perfectly still. Nettie, who was now awake and propped up with pillows on the bed, just stared at Silas with those wide, empty gray eyes. Hannah was the first one to find her voice. You mean that? For real? I do not say things I do not mean. For how long? Silas looked right into her eyes. For as long as you all will have me. That sounds like forever talk, she whispered. Maybe it is. But you hardly know us, she argued. We could be awful. Sam leaves his boots right where you trip over them. Clara talks to her doll at 3 in the morning. Joe sleeps with a knife. And Nettie... Hannah's gaze drifted to her little sister. Nettie might not ever speak again. Silas smiled a little. Well, I leave my boots where I trip over them, too. I have been talking to a horse for 6 years because there was nobody else to talk to. And I have spent many nights with a gun in my lap. He looked over at Nettie. And if she never says another word, that is all right. She does not have to talk. She just has to be here. Nettie's small hand began to move. It was slow and very deliberate. She pointed a small finger right at Silas. Then she pressed her hand flat against her own chest, right over her heart. Hannah's breath hitched in her throat. She has not done that since Mama. Her voice trailed off, and she had to swallow hard. Mama used to put her hand on her heart whenever she would say, I love you, and Nettie started doing it back to her. It was their special thing. Silas looked at the little 4-year-old girl who would not speak, but who had just said the loudest thing anyone had heard all night. His throat felt tight, and his eyes started to burn. He slowly raised his own hand and pressed it flat against his chest, holding it right there. Nettie's face did not change, but her eyes did. Something flickered to life in that empty gray space. It was something small and stubborn, and very much alive, like a single candle being lit in a room that had been dark for a very, very long time. Clara was the one who broke the silence. Rosie wants to know if this means we are a family now. Silas cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. What does Clara want to know? The same thing, she whispered. It is always the same thing. Well, then you can tell Rosie that we are working on it. Sam stood up and walked right over to Silas. He just stood there for a second, his fists clenched tight at his sides. His whole body was trembling with something that he could not get past the stutter in his throat. Then he gave up on words altogether. He wrapped his arms around Silas's waist and just held on for dear life. Silas gently put a hand on the boy's head. Sam's shoulders shook once, then twice, and then they were still. Oh, okay, Sam mumbled into Silas's shirt. Okay. Joe did not move from his spot by the door. He watched the whole scene unfold with those sharp, watchful eyes of his. When Silas met his gaze, Joe gave him the slightest little nod. It was not acceptance, not just yet, but it was an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, this man was something different, something worth watching for a little while, longer before making up his mind. Outside, the night was clear and freezing cold, filled with more stars than you could count. Somewhere to the south in a town called Elk Creek, Sheriff Reuben Cross was busy writing a letter to a man he swore he did not know. And somewhere even farther south, in a warm room with a black leather book lying open on a table, Victor Crane was drawing a line through 5 names. Beside them, he wrote a single word, found. Reverend Elijah Pope had only one arm, a Bible that was worn soft from years of use, and eyes that seemed to look right through Silas, like they could see the very bones beneath his skin. 5 children, the Reverend said, his voice a low rumble. 5. And you are wanting to keep them? I do, Silas said. You can hardly keep yourself, Mallister. I have watched you ride into town once a month, and you look a little thinner each and every time. You drink more than you should. You talk less than you ought to. And now you want to raise 5 orphans in that little cabin of yours that looks like it is one hard winter away from falling to pieces. Silas just sat there in the church pew and took it all in. The Reverend was not wrong about any of it. The preacher stood up at the altar. His empty left sleeve was pinned neatly to his coat, and his one good hand rested on the back of a wooden chair. He had lost that arm at Shiloh, and had found something much harder than bone to take its place: conviction. I am not asking for your approval, Silas finally said. I am asking for your help. Help with what exactly? The Reverend asked. Legal standing. I need papers that say those children are under my care. Something that will stand up in court if a man named Victor Crane shows up to take them. Pope's expression changed. It was a small shift, but Silas saw it plain as day. The preacher's jaw went tight, and his good hand flattened out on the wooden chair arm. You said his name was Crane. You know that name, I know the name. Pope stepped down from the altar, settling onto the pew right across from Silas. His voice got low. Victor Crane has passed through this territory 3 times in the last 2 years, and every single time children have vanished. Mostly from families on the wagon trails. Poor folks, the desperate ones. He rides up flashing papers and promises, talking in legal words that sound right even when they're rotten to the core. So where do the children end up? I have been trying to figure that out. Nobody says a word. The families that sold their little ones are too full of shame. The ones who had them taken are too scared to speak up. And the law, Pope just shook his head. Well, the law in this part of the country is Judge Cornelius Stark. And Stark runs things just like a spider runs its web. You do not even see the threads until you are already tangled up in them. Judge Stark, the territorial judge, he is based out of Casper, but his power stretches a whole lot further than that. Cross answers to him. I reckon half the sheriffs in all of Wyoming answer to him, and from what I have managed to put together, Crane answers to him too. Silas leaned in closer. So the fella selling children has a judge watching his back. I cannot prove it, not yet anyway. But I have sent letters to the federal marshal's office down in Denver, twice. Heard nothing back. Pope's gaze locked onto Silas. You need to understand what you are walking into here. This is not just one bad man with a fancy book. This is a whole system. You got papers, badges, courtrooms, all of them working hand in hand to make stealing children look like it is legal business. I understand. Do you, though? Because if you choose to fight this, they are not just going to come for the children. They are going to come for you. They will paint you as a kidnapper, a squatter, an unfit guardian. They will use every trick they know, and believe me, they have got plenty of them. Let them come. Pope watched him for a long, quiet moment. You rode with the cavalry, did not you? 12 years. It shows. You have got that look about you. The one men get when they have made up their mind to charge. And nothing short of a bullet is going to stop them. Pope reached into his coat and pulled out a paper, all folded up. I started putting these together about 6 months back. Guardianship papers. I wrote 'em up for a family over in Sheridan whose children were getting threatened, but the family pulled up stakes before we could get 'em filed. He laid the document on the pew between 'em. The legal language is solid. I had a lawyer in Denver look it over. If we write in your name and the children's names, and I sign it as a witness, it will give you temporary legal custody until a formal hearing can happen. You think it will stand up against Crane's papers? That all depends on the judge. If Stark is the one hearing the case, you will lose before you even open your mouth. But if we can get this mess in front of a federal court, that is a whole different story. How do we manage that? We find proof that Crane is moving children across territorial lines. That makes it a federal matter, clean out of Stark's hands. What kind of proof? Testimony? Records? Other families who are willing to speak up. Pope folded his hand there in his lap. I have been fighting this fight quietly for 2 years now, Silas. Writing letters, asking questions, and getting absolutely nowhere because I am just one man with one arm and a church full of folks too terrified to take a stand. But you have got something I do not. And what is that? 5 children who can testify about exactly what Victor Crane does. 5 witnesses with names and faces and a story that would make any federal judge sit up and pay close attention. Silas thought about Hannah telling him about that black leather book, about the numbers written down next to their names, about Crane calling her brothers and sisters damaged goods. Hannah is 12. Sam has a bad stutter. Nettie does not talk at all. Joe is half Cheyenne, and that means half the territory will not believe a word he says. And Clara is just 7. You really think anyone is going to listen to them? I think the voices of 5 children are a lot harder to ignore than the letters from one preacher. They have been through enough already. They sure have. And they will go through a whole lot worse if Crane gets his hands on them. Pope's voice got softer. I'm not asking them to be soldiers, Silas. I'm just asking them to tell the truth. That is all it is. Silas picked up the guardianship papers. He read them over twice. His hands were rock steady, but deep inside, something was shaken, way down where all the old fears lived. The fear of failing, of not being strong enough, of standing over more fresh graves knowing he could have done something different. Where do I sign my name? Right on that line, and I will need the children's full names. Hannah Ruth Dawson, Samuel Dawson, Clara Mae Dawson, Annette Dawson, and Josiah Whitfield. Pope wrote down each name, slow and careful with his one hand, the pen moving steady. When he was done, he signed his own name and pressed the church seal into the hot wax at the bottom. This here makes you their legal guardian in the eyes of God, and if we get lucky, in the eyes of the law. Guard it with your life. Silas folded the paper and tucked it inside his coat right over his heart. Thank you, Reverend. Do not thank me yet, son. This fight is just getting started. Silas was getting Buck ready outside the church when a hand grabbed his arm. He spun around, his hand dropping to his colt, only to find himself looking at old Tom Kincaid. Easy there, son. It is just me. Tom was 67 years old with a face like dried leather and hands that could still gentle a horse or break a man's jaw depending on the situation. He had been Silas's neighbor from the very start, the man who dug the graves for Catherine and Lily. The man who came to check on Silas every few weeks, whether Silas liked it or not. Heard you took on some passengers, Tom said. News travels. In a small town, everything travels, and gossip travels the fastest. Tom leaned up against the hitching post. 5 kids, Silas. You sure you know what you are doing? No, an honest answer. That is good. A man who is dead sure about something this big is either a liar or a fool. Tom crossed his arms over his chest. What do you need? I did not ask for any help, and I did not wait for you to ask. What do you need? Silas looked at this old man who had been more of a father to him than his own blood ever was. I need somebody to help me fix up the cabin. It is going to need another room, maybe 2. I cannot keep 5 children in a place built for just one man. I can still swing a hammer. I need somebody to teach the boys how to work the cattle. I'm going to be stretched mighty thin. I can handle that, too. And I need someone who will stand right there with me if things get ugly with the law. Tom's eyes turned hard, not angry, just certain. Son, I stood my ground at Gettysburg when the whole Confederate army came yelling up that hill. I have stood in much worse places than some courtroom in Wyoming. You just tell me when and where, and I will be there. You do not owe me a thing, Tom. This ain't about owing anybody. This is about what is right. And what is right is that 5 little children do not get sold off to some mine operator just because a judge decided they were not quite human. Tom stood up straight. Now, you better introduce me to these kids before we lose the whole day. They rode back to the cabin together. Tom was on his old mare, Silas on Buck, and Joe rode behind Silas, quiet as he had been all morning. When they got to the cabin, Hannah had the door open before their boots even hit the ground. Her hand was resting on her knife. It seemed like it was always resting on her knife. Who is he? Hannah asked, jerking her chin toward Tom. Thomas Kincaid, my neighbor. He is here to help us. Tom swung down from his horse and walked toward the door. He stopped about 3 feet away and took off his hat. Miss Dawson, The name is Tom. I am old. I am loud. And I happen to make the best venison stew in the whole Wyoming territory. Your guardian here asked me to stop by, and I brought a haunch of deer that is needing to be cooked." Hannah looked from the venison to Tom and then back to Silas. "You told him about us?" He already knew. Small town. Does everybody know? Most likely. Hannah's face got all tight. "That means Crane knows where we are, too. That is exactly why Tom is here." Tom stepped right on inside and went to work like he had been living there his whole life. He found the cooking pot, started cutting up the venison, and had water boiling before Hannah could even offer to help. Clara watched him from behind her little doll. "Rosie wants to know if you are a grandfather." Tom looked over at the little girl. "I can be whatever you need me to be, little miss. Rosie needs a grandfather." "Well, then Rosie has got one." A smile spread across Clara's face. It was the biggest one Silas had seen on her since the night she had crawled up into his lap. She walked right over to Tom and held up her doll. "This is Rosie. She is shy." "Well, you can tell Rosie that I am shy, too. We can just be shy together." "You do not look shy. That is the best kind of shy, the kind you can't see." Clara let out a little giggle. The sound echoed in the cabin like it was something stolen from a different world. A world where children laughed instead of crying, where old men told jokes instead of digging graves, where a family could be put together with nothing but stubbornness and need. Sam came in from the barn where he had been feeding Buck. He saw Tom and just stopped cold. His jaw locked up. The stutter started building up behind his teeth like water pressing on a dam. "Sam," Silas said, "this here is Tom Consincade. He's going to be helping out around here." Sam's eyes shot to Tom's hands, looking for weapons, for balled-up fists, for all the things a boy learns to check for when a strange man comes into his space. You a friend of Silas? The closest thing he has got to one. And you must be the young fella who has been keeping his sisters safe." Sam stood up a little straighter. That is my job. That is a hard job for a boy your age." "I am not a boy. No, I can see that plain enough. You are a man who just happens to be 10 years old. That is a different thing altogether, and it is rarer than you might think." Tom held out his hand. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Sam." Sam looked at the offered hand, then up at Tom's face. Then he reached out and shook it. His grip was strong. His eyes did not water. But you could see something in his shoulders relax just a little bit, like the weight was shifting. It was not gone, but now it was shared. They all ate venison stew that night, and it was the best meal that little cabin had seen since the day Silas built it. Tom told stories about the old days, about hunting buffalo before the herds were gone, about the war, and about building a life in a country that did not seem to want you. He talked the way old men do, easy and rambling, and the children all listened because his voice was warm, and his stories sounded like the truth. Even Joe listened. He did not join in, but he listened. Did not change from his post by the door, but his eyes followed every word Tom spoke. And at one point, when Tom brought up trading with the Cheyenne, Joe's hand went to his mother's knife. It was not a defensive move, but one of memory. Tom saw it. He did not make a big deal out of it, but he smoothly changed his story to talk more about the Cheyenne. He spoke of their skill with horses, their bravery, and the way they could read the land like it was a book written in grass and stone and sky. "They were the finest people I ever had dealings with," Tom said. "A Cheyenne's word was as good as gold, better even. Gold is something you can steal, but you cannot take a man's word from him." Joe's voice came from the doorway, quiet but firm. "My mother said the very same thing. Your mother was a wise woman then, and I would bet she was right about most things." "She was," Joe said. Tom looked at Joe for a good long moment. Then he gave a single nod, the kind of nod one man gives another as a sign of respect, and went back to eating his stew. After supper was done, Tom left with a promise to come back in the morning with tools to help expand the cabin. Silas walked with him out to his horse. "Those are good kids," Tom said as he swung up into the saddle. "All of them. You can tell they have been through some terrible times. I can see it, Silas agreed, especially the older girl. She is carrying a grown man's load on a child's back. You have got to find a way to help her set it down. I am trying. Well, you need to try harder, Tom said, his voice serious. Because if you do not, she is going to break. And she will break quietly, the way strong people always do. You will not even know it has happened until it is too late. Tom rode off into the darkness. Silas stood there on the porch, watching until the sound of his horse's hooves faded away completely. Then he went back inside. Hannah was at the sink washing the dinner plates. The other children were already asleep, even Joe, who had finally given in to his exhaustion, with his knife still clutched in his hand. "He is a good man," Hannah said, without even looking up from her work. "Tom, he is real." "He is." "And the Reverend? Is he real too?" "As real as they come." "And the woman at the store, Maggie? She is real too." Hannah set the last clean plate down and dried her hands on a towel. She turned around to face Silas. In the soft light from the fireplace, he could see the little cracks in her armor widening. They were not breaking, just widening, like a wall that has too much pressure building up behind it. "All my life," she said softly, "the real people have been the ones who always leave. The fake ones are the ones who stay, but only until they get whatever it is they want. I do not know how to tell the difference anymore." "You are 12 years old. You should not have to know the difference." "But I do," she insisted, "because I have 4 other people who are depending on me to get it right." Silas sat down in a chair across from her. "Hannah, you listen to me. You do not have 4 people depending on you anymore. You have 4 people and you have me. That is different." "How?" "Because I am the adult now. All the worrying, and the planning, and the staying up all night trying to figure out what comes next. That is my job now, not yours. You cannot just say that and make it true." "No," he agreed. "I have to prove it, and I will. But you have to let me." Hannah just stared into the fire. Her jaw was tight. Her hands squeezed the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned bone white. "If I let go," she whispered, her voice barely there, "and you let us fall, I don't think I can pick up the pieces again. I could hardly do it the last time. I'm not going to let you fall. Everybody lets us fall. Well, I ain't everybody, and I went and got papers that say those kids are mine to look after now. Legal papers, all signed by a preacher and sealed by the church. Nobody's taken them from me without one heck of a fight." Hannah stared right at him. "Show me." Silas reached into his coat, pulled out the guardianship document, and passed it to her. Hannah read it over real slow, her lips silently forming the official sound in words. When she reached the part with the names, her fingers paused. "You put all of us on here. All 5 of us." She looked up. "You even put Joe. Joe's a part of this family. But he ain't our blood, neither am I. Blood ain't what makes a family, Hannah. Choosing to be one does." Hannah carefully folded the paper and handed it back to him. When she looked up again, her eyes were shining. Not with tears, but with something a lot tougher. "If they come after us," she said, her voice steady, "I'm fighting too. Don't you dare try to protect me from it. Don't you try and hide me in the barn. I've got a right to fight for my own family." "Agreed. And I'm keeping my knife. Wouldn't even think of trying to take it from you." Hannah gave a single firm nod. Then she did something he hadn't seen her do since that first night he found them. She sat down. Not on the floor beside Nettie, not at the table where she could keep an eye on the door. She just sat in that chair by the fire, pulled her knees up to her chest, and leaned her head back like she was only 12 years old, just a little girl. "I am tired, Silas. I know. I have been tired ever since Mama passed. I know that too. Is it all right if I am tired for just a little bit, just for a little while?" "It is all right. I will be on watch tonight." Hannah closed her eyes. Her breathing got slower, and her hands finally uncurled. The knife was still tucked in her belt, but her fingers were not resting on it for the first time since Missouri. Silas sat by the door, right where Joe usually stood guard. He checked his Colt revolver, 6 rounds, with 20 more in the box. Tom would be riding back in the morning. Pope had the papers all filed proper. Maggie had supplies on the way, but it was not nearly enough. He knew Crane was somewhere out there. Stark was pulling strings behind him. Cross was a compromised man. The whole legal machine of the territory could be turned on one man and 5 children with a single signature from the right judge. But Silas had one thing they did not. He had folks willing to plant their boots and stand firm. A reverend who had lost an arm but found his backbone. A storekeeper who fed strangers simply because it was the right thing to do. An old man who had stared down the Confederate Army and was not about to be scared by some judges. And he had 5 kids who had made it through a blizzard, a betrayal, and a fever, and were still standing, still breathing, still ready to fight. Let Crane come. Let him bring his book, and his legal papers, and his bought and paid for sheriff, and his crooked judge. Let him ride right up to this cabin with every last weapon the law could hand him. He would find a bolted door, a loaded gun, and a man who had nothing left to lose except for everything he had just found. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The children were all asleep. And outside the snow began to fall again, quiet and steady, covering up tracks and trails and all the proof of who had been where and when. But some tracks just cannot be covered. Some trails, once you start down them, you have to follow all the way to the end. And this trail, Silas knew deep down, was heading straight for a final showdown. Crane showed up on a Tuesday. Silas was out in the barn teaching Sam how to properly brush buck when Joe suddenly appeared in the doorway. The boy did not say a word, just pointed his chin to the south. Silas set the brush down and walked to the big barn door. 3 riders were making their way up the trail. The man out front wore a long black leather coat. "Sam, get inside. Tell Hannah to bar the door and keep every single one of you away from the windows. What is going on? Go on now." Sam took off running. Silas pulled out his Colt, checked the cylinder, and put it back in its holster. 6 rounds. He touched his coat pocket where the guardianship papers rested against his chest. Then he stepped out into the biting cold and waited. Victor Crane reined his horse to a halt about 20 feet from the cabin. He was the spitting image of what Hannah had described. Tall, clean, with a gray beard trimmed so neat it looked drawn on. A scar ran across his chin like someone had tried to cut his lion mouth right off his face and missed. A gold watch chain was draped across his vest. Behind him sat 2 men with rifles resting on their saddles and faces that told you they were ready to use them. Crane smiled, the kind of smile that made your own skin want to crawl right off your bones and go hide somewhere. "Mr. Mallister, I have been looking forward to this meeting. Wish I could say the same. That is understandable. You have been listening to stories about me from the children, I expect. Children can have such powerful imaginations. Get off my land." Crane did not budge. His horse shifted in the snow, its breath puffing out in white clouds. "I am here on official business. I have a court order, signed by Judge Cornelius Stark himself, granting me legal guardianship of 5 minor children who are currently in your unlawful possession." He pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it up for Silas to see. "Should I read it to you? I can read just fine. And I have got papers of my own. Ah, yes. Reverend Pope's little document." Crane's smile got even wider. "I am afraid a piece of paper from a church does not overrule an order from a territorial court. Mr. Mallister, the law is mighty clear on this matter. The law is also mighty clear about buying and selling children. I do not buy and sell children. I provide placement services for orphans who are in need. It is charity work. It is difficult, thankless work, but somebody has to do it. Reckon somebody has got to put a bullet in you too. The only question is who gets the privilege." Crane's smile faltered, just for a second. Then it came back, bigger than before. "Threats are not going to help your situation. In fact, they will hurt it quite a bit when I report this little chat to Judge Stark. He reached into his coat again and pulled out a second document. This here is a warrant for your arrest. Kidnapping, harboring stolen property, and obstruction of lawful custody. Those children are not property. The law sees it differently. Then the law is wrong. The law is never wrong, Mr. Mallister. It is just inconvenient for folks who do not take the time to understand it. Crane tucked his papers away. Now, I'm going to give you one chance, and one chance only. Hand over the children without a fuss, and I will ask Judge Stark to drop these criminal charges. You can go back to your cattle and your whiskey and your quiet little life. No harm done. And the children will be placed in appropriate facilities where they will get food, shelter, and gainful employment. Mines? You mean mines? I mean employment that is suited to their abilities. A 4-year-old who does not even talk. What kind of employment is suited to her abilities? Crane's jaw clenched up. The first little crack in his polished shell. That is not your concern. I am making it my concern. Behind Silas, the cabin door creaked open. He heard it, and his stomach dropped clear to his boots. He had told Hannah to stay inside, to bar the door, to keep everyone away from the windows. Hannah walked right out and stood beside him. The knife was tucked in her belt. Her face was pale as a ghost, but her eyes were burning like fire. "Hannah, get back inside." "No, that is not a request, and I am not asking for your permission." Hannah stared straight at Crane. "Hello, Mr. Crane." Crane's whole expression changed. Something hungry and mean moved behind his eyes. "Hannah, you are looking well. Better than the last time I laid eyes on you. The last time you saw me, you were leaving me and my whole family to freeze to death. That is not what happened. That is exactly what happened. You took our horses. You took our food. You told my brother he was worth $20, and my baby sister was worth $5. Then you just rode away and left us in the middle of a blizzard. You are confused, child. The trauma of losing your parents has played tricks on your memory. My memory is perfect, and so is my brother's, and so is Joe's. That is 3 witnesses who remember every single word you said." Crane's smile vanished completely. He glanced at his 2 hired men, then back at Hannah. "This is precisely why children should not be allowed to make their own decisions. They do not have the ability to understand complex situations. I understand plenty. I understand you buy kids from families down on their luck and sell them off to the mines. I understand you have got a judge in your pocket and a sheriff on your payroll. And I understand that if you take us, we will just disappear, and nobody will ever ask a single question, Hannah." Silas's voice was low and quiet. "That is enough." "It is not nearly enough." Hannah took another step forward. "You want to take me? Fine. You come take me yourself. Do not send your hired guns. Do not hide behind your papers. You walk right up here and put your hands on me, and you will see what happens." Crane just stared at her. A 12-year-old girl, 90 pounds soaking wet, standing in the snow, armed with a kitchen knife and the fury of someone who had lost everything and was refusing to lose one more thing. "You have made your point," Crane said. His voice was different now. All the charm was gone. What was left was cold and flat and ugly. "I will be back with the sheriff and a full warrant. When I return, anyone who stands in the way will be arrested and the children will be taken by force if need be." He turned his horse around. "You've got 24 hours, Mallister. I suggest you use them wisely." The 3 riders vanished down the trail. Silas watched them go. Then he turned to Hannah. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the effort it took not to put a bullet right in Crane's back. "I told you to stay inside, and I told you I fight for my family. That was not fighting. That was painting a big red target on your own back. He already had a target on me. At least now he knows I will bite back." Silas opened his mouth to argue, but the door opened up again. Sam stood there, his face all tight, his hands balled up into little fists. "I heard all of it. What are we going to do? We are not going to panic. I am not panicking. I am asking what we are going to do." Behind Sam, Clara's face appeared in the doorway. She was holding Rosie tight against her chest. "The bad man is coming back, is not he?" "Yes," Silas said, "because telling them a lie would be worse than the truth." "But he is not taking you." "How do you know?" "Because I will not let him." "What if you cannot stop him?" The question just hung there in the frozen air. Clara's eyes were steady, too steady for a girl who had lost so many, a 7-year-old girl. She had been let down so many times she knew the hard truth. Wanting to stop a bad thing and being able to were two different worlds entirely. Silas knelt down in the snow to get eye to eye with her. He said, "You remember what your brother said about promises? That they are just words folks use right before they disappear." Clara gave a little nod. "He is right. Words are cheap. So I am not going to offer you a promise. I am going to give you a fact. And here is the fact. Every single soul in this cabin, plus Tom and Maggie and Reverend Pope, all of us are going to stand like a stone wall between you and that man. That is not a promise. That is just what is happening now." Clara lifted her doll, Rosie, up to her ear and listened for a moment. Then she looked right back at Silas. "Rosie says facts are better than promises." "Well, Rosie is the smartest person I know." Silas got to his feet and looked at the 4 young faces staring back at him. There was Hannah, holding her knife, her eyes full of fire. Sam, with his balled-up fists and his troublesome stutter. Clara, with her doll and a wisdom no child should ever have. And through the open door behind them, Joe sat by Ned's bed, his hand resting on his mother's knife. "Ready?" Silas said, "All right, here is what we are going to do. Hannah, you ride over to Tom's ranch. You tell him Crane paid us a visit. Tell him we have got 24 hours. Sam, you ride out to Maggie's store. Tell her the same thing. Ask her to please get a message to Reverend Pope. I cannot ride that far. Well, Buck knows the trail. You just hang on tight and let that horse do the walking." "What about me?" Clara asked. "You have got the most important job of all. You stay here with Nettie and Joe. Keep your little sister warm, and you keep her safe. You think you can handle that?" Clara nodded, her face as serious as a judge. "Rosie and me are real good at keeping people safe. I know you are." Within the hour, Hannah and Sam were gone, riding off in opposite directions. Silas stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched them disappear. Just 2 children on horseback, carrying messages that could mean the difference between living free and living in chains. It felt all kinds of wrong sending them out there by themselves. Every single thing about this felt wrong. Joe came up and stood right beside him. "You should have sent me. I need you right here." "Why?" "Because if things go sideways before they get back, you are the best fighter we have got in this cabin." Joe just looked at him. Something in the boy's face changed then. It was not exactly pride. It was recognition. It was the simple acknowledgement that someone saw what he truly was and saw value in it instead of something to be scared of. "My mother fought when she had to," Joe said quietly. "She never went looking for trouble, but she sure never ran from it. We will not run either. If Crane shows up again with a bunch of armed men, you and I cannot hold this cabin. Not with 2 little ones inside. Then we do not hold the cabin. We move." "Where to?" Silas had been chewing on this since Crane rode off. "There is an old mining camp about 5 miles northeast of here. Been abandoned for 10 years. It has got stone walls, a good defensible spot, and only one way in. You have been there. I scouted it back in my cavalry days. It is solid. If we have got to run, I can carry Nettie. You're only 9 years old. I carried my mother's body for 2 miles after she died. I can carry a 4-year-old. Those words hit Silas like a kick from a mule. He looked at Joe, this boy who had buried his own mother with his bare hands at 9 years, old, who carried her knife and her wisdom and all her sorrow with him every single day. And in that moment, he understood something that he should have seen a long time ago. Joe was not some child just playing at being a man. He was a warrior who just happened to be young. "If it comes to that," Silas said, his voice low, "we all go together. Nobody gets left behind. That is what my mother said when the soldiers came. Nobody gets left behind." Joe paused. She was the one they left behind. "I am not your mother, and this situation is not that one. No, it is not." Joe turned and walked back into the cabin without saying another word. The hours crawled by like wounded snakes. Silas checked his ammunition. He cleaned his Colt. and he sharpened his knife. The kinds of things a man does when the only thing left to do is wait, and the only cure for fear is to keep your hands busy. Clara sat with Nettie, telling her stories through Rosie's voice. They were fantastic tales about a doll who lived in a magical cabin where no one was ever cold or hungry or scared. Nettie just listened. She did not say a word, but her eyes followed Clara's every move. And then once, just for a second, the corner of her mouth twitched. It was not a smile, but the ghost of one. It was a memory of what a smile felt like before the world taught her that being silent was the safest way to be. "Rosie is building a castle," Clara whispered to Nettie. "It has a great big door that no bad people can ever get through. And inside, there is a fire that never burns out, and food that never runs out, and a pa who never ever leaves." Joe watched them from his spot by the door. His knife was out. His eyes were hard as stone. But when Clara said that word, pa, something in his tough expression just cracked, like a tiny splinter in old wood. Then he turned his head away and went right back to watching the trail. Hannah was the first one back, riding her horse hard, with Tom's horse thundering right behind her, the old man himself in the saddle. Tom swung down, holding his rifle and a sack of ammunition. "Crane has got friends in town," Tom said, trying to catch his breath. "3 more men rode in this morning. They are hired guns. Been asking around about Mallister's place. How many does that make? Crane plus 5, maybe 6 men. All of them armed and looking for trouble. Sheriff Cross is staying out of it officially, but he is not about to stop them either." Sam got back 20 minutes later. His horse, Buck, was covered in sweat and breathing hard. The boys slid right off the horse and ran to Silas. "Maggie is sending word to Pope. She said something else, too." Sam took a deep breath. "She said there is a new man in town. He came in this morning on the stagecoach from Denver. He is a federal man, and he is wearing a star." Silas and Tom looked at each other. "A federal marshal. That is what Maggie called him. She said Pope is talking to him right this minute. Did she say why he is here? She said that Reverend Pope's letters finally got to somebody important." Something that felt a little like hope started to open up in Silas's chest. He had learned the hard way not to trust in hope. Hope was usually the first casualty when the bullets started flying, but this was something. "We cannot count on that," Tom said. "If this marshal is the real deal, he might just help. But if he is not, or if Stark got to him first, then we are in a worse spot than we were before." "I agree. We will plan for the worst." They spent that whole afternoon getting ready. Tom helped Silas move the most important supplies out to the old mining camp, making 3 trips with the pack horses. Joe scouted the approach to the camp and found 2 spots where a rifleman could cover the entrance. Hannah took inventory of all the food and ammunition with the precision of a quartermaster. Sam asked Silas to teach him how to shoot. "You are 10 years old. I know how old I am. Teach me to shoot." Silas looked at the boy, at those fierce eyes and those steady hands, and that jaw that was clamped down tight on his fear, refusing to let it show. "You ever fired a gun before?" "No. It is loud, it kicks like a mule, and it changes you. Once you pull that trigger, you cannot ever unpull it." "I know that." "Do you really? Because this is not some kind of game, Sam. If things go bad tomorrow, people could get hurt, they could die. People have already died. My pa died, my ma died. I could not do a thing about it because I was too little and too young and too damn useless." Sam's stutter completely vanished on that curse word. The emotion just burned it clean away. "I am not useless anymore. Teach me." So, Silas taught him. Not everything, just the basics. How to hold the rifle steady. How to breathe right. How to sight down the barrel and squeeze, not pull, the trigger. Sam listened to every single word. He absorbed every little detail. And when he fired that first shot, the recoil knocked him back a step. But he did not fall down. He just planted his feet, set his jaw, and raised that rifle right back up. Good, real good. Again. Sam fired 3 more times. Each shot he took was steadier than the one before it. The boy was a natural. It was like his hands were making up for his mouth. Everything his stutter ever stole from his words, his body gave back in precision and control. "That is enough for today," Silas said. "1 more. That is enough." Sam lowered the rifle. His eyes were bright and his chin was held high. "Thank you. Do not thank me. I just handed a weapon to a 10-year-old boy. That is not something a man ought to feel good about. It is something a father would do." Silas stopped cold. Sam just stood there holding the rifle, looking up at him with an expression that held no stutter, no hesitation, and no fear. Just a boy looking at a man and seeing something he truly needed. "Yeah," Silas said quietly. "I suppose it is." Night fell on the valley. They all gathered inside the cabin for what could very well be the last peaceful evening they would ever have together. Tom cooked up some venison. Maggie showed up around dusk, bringing more supplies and news. Pope is with the federal man right now. His name is Marshal James Whitcomb. He has been investigating Stark for 6 months. The letters that Pope sent finally landed on the right desk. Is he coming here? Pope says to give him until morning. If Whitcomb is legitimate, he will come with the authority to stop Crane for good. If he is not, well, we will know by sunrise. That is a whole lot of ifs, Hannah said. It is a lot of hope, Maggie said, gently correcting her. And sometimes hope is all a body has. Hope did not save my mama and papa. No, honey, but it kept you going long enough for us to find you. Hannah looked over at Maggie, this woman who would feed a complete stranger and tell a hard truth with the softest touch. She glanced at Tom, sitting by the fire, sharpening his hunting knife. She saw Silas checking his Colt revolver, and then her eyes fell on the guardianship papers Pope had pinned to the wall for all the world to see. "Why are y'all doing all this?" Hannah finally asked. "You did not know us from Adam a week ago. We are just nobody, 5 kids from a wagon that is no more. Why do you even care?" Maggie knelt down so she was eye to eye with the girl. "Because for 30 years, I have sat in this town and watched good folks do absolutely nothing while terrible things happened. Because my own husband died begging me to be braver than he ever was. And because when I look at you, child, I see the daughter I was never blessed with. And I will be damned if I'm going to stand by and let any man take her away." Hannah's defenses did not crumble this time. They did not need to. The wall she built around her heart was still there, strong as ever, keeping her safe. But for the first time, she opened a little door in it, just big enough for Maggie to come inside. She leaned in and rested her head on Maggie's shoulder for just a second, just long enough to feel what it was like to be held by a woman who smelled of flour, soap, and pure kindness. Then she stood up straight, adjusted her spine, and put a hand on her own knife. "What time does Crane get here?" "At sunrise," Tom said without looking up. "Men like him always show up with the sun. It makes them feel big and powerful. Then we will be ready for him at sunrise." They all settled in for a long night. Tom agreed to take the first watch. Silas said he would take the second. Young Joe insisted he take the third, and not a single person argued with him. That boy had earned his right to stand guard with the men. Around midnight, Silas went to check on every last child. Sam was fast asleep with a rifle lying right beside him, close enough to grab. Clara was curled up with Rosie, whispering in her sleep about big castles with giant doors. Joe sat straight up against the wall, his eyes wide open, a knife resting on his knees as he watched the darkness. Hannah was lying next to Nettie, one arm thrown over her little sister, the other hand resting on her knife, even in her dreams. And then there was Nettie. Silas knelt down by the bed and just looked at the littlest one. The child's eyes were open. She was just staring at him in the dark. Those quiet gray eyes of hers held so much silence, like a stone at the bottom of a river. Then she did something she had not done since that very first night. She reached out her tiny hand and pressed it flat against his chest, right over his heart. Silas covered her hand with his own, holding it there, feeling the small, warm weight of a child's trust against his own heartbeat. "I have got you," he whispered, "all of you, and nobody is ever taking you anywhere." Nettie's hand fell away, her eyes fluttered closed, and she was finally asleep. Silas stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling. The sky was clear as glass, filled with hard, bright stars. The moon cast a silver glow across the white land. Somewhere out in that cold, Crane was getting his men together. Stark was signing his crooked papers. The gears of a corrupt law were grinding and starting to move, and somewhere between here and Elk Creek, a United States Marshal was making a choice that would decide if 5 children got to live as free people or if they would vanish into the dark forever. The morning would tell the tale. The morning would bring men with guns and badges and papers who believed that power meant you could own another person's life. But that morning would also bring Silas Mallister and Tom Consincade and Maggie Holloway and a one-armed preacher who may have lost an arm but had not lost his fight. And it would bring 5 children who had survived everything this world could throw at them and were still on their feet. The fire in the hearth burned low. Silas loaded his Colt revolver one last time. 6 rounds inside the cylinder, 20 more in the box nearby, and right behind him, breathing in the dark, were 5 reasons to make every single one of those bullets count. Dawn broke red and angry. The light spilled across the snow like a bloodstain, a warning. Silas was already standing at the door, his Colt loaded and his jaw set hard. When he heard the first sound of hoofbeats, Tom heard them too. The old man got up from his chair, grabbing his rifle, and moved to the window. 6 riders coming in fast. Crane was out front, plain as day in his black coat. 2 men were on either side of him. 3 more followed close behind. Tom squinted his eyes. And they are bringing a wagon. Bringing a wagon means they are planning on taking those children today. Silas looked back inside the cabin. Hannah was already awake, her knife in her belt standing over Nettie's bed like a guard. Sam stood right next to her, holding the rifle Silas had taught him how to use, gripping it with both hands. Joe was posted at the back window, his mother's knife out and ready, his eyes sweeping the tree line, watching for anyone trying to sneak up behind them. Clara sat on the floor with Nettie safe in her lap. Rosie was squeezed between them, whispering to her doll in a voice so low you could not hear the words. "Hannah," Silas said, "take the children into the back room. And bar the door." "No, this is not a discussion." "You are right," she said. "It is not. I am staying. You are 12 years old. And I have buried both my parents, survived a blizzard, and kept 4 other people alive when it felt like the whole world was trying to kill us. I am staying." Silas did not have a second to argue. The riders were getting close now, so close he could hear Crane's voice yelling out, "Mallister, your 24 hours are over. I have brought the sheriff, a deputy, and the legal authority to remove those children. Open this door, or we will open it for you." Silas stepped out onto the porch. Tom followed right behind him, his rifle held loosely at his side. The cold air hit them both sharp and clean. It was the kind of cold that made everything feel terribly real and terribly final. Crane sat high on his horse out front. Behind him, Sheriff Reuben Cross sat on his own horse, looking like a man who would rather be anywhere else in the world. The badge on his chest caught the red light of the rising sun. 4 hired men were on either side of them, their rifles out, their faces showing nothing at all. "Morning, Crane," Silas said. "I see you brought your whole circus with you." "I brought the law, Mr. Mallister." "That is something you seem set on ignoring." Crane held up a piece of paper. "This is a court order, signed by Judge Cornelius Stark. Custody of 5 minor children is transferred to me, effective right now. Sheriff Cross is here to see it is enforced." Silas looked past him, right at the sheriff. "Are you really going to do this, Sheriff? Take 5 children and just hand them over to a man who sells kids to the mines?" The sheriff's jaw got tight. His eyes darted away. He would not look Silas in the eye. "I am just enforcing a court order. That is my job. Your job is to protect folks, and that includes children. The law says those children belong with their legal guardian, and that is Mr. Crane. That law was bought and paid for, Sheriff, and you know it." The sheriff's face turned red. His horse shifted underneath him, feeling the tension in the air. "I do not want any trouble, Mallister. Just hand them over and nobody has to get hurt." Nobody is handing anybody over. Crane's patience finally snapped. That is enough. Sheriff, execute the order. Cross swung down from his horse real slow. His hand was on his gun, but he did not pull it. He walked toward the cabin like a man walking to his own funeral. Behind him, his hired guns started to spread out, covering all the angles. Tom raised his rifle. That is close enough, Reuben. Cross stopped in his tracks. Tom, do not do this. Do not make me do this. I have got a legal order. You have got a piece of paper signed by a crooked man. That is not the same thing. In the eyes of the law, it is. Then the law is blinder than a bat in a blizzard. The standoff stretched on. Silas could count his own heartbeats. 6 men with guns against 2 of them. The odds had not gotten any better since yesterday. They were still terrible. Then they heard more hoofbeats, coming from the south and coming fast. Several horses. Everyone turned to look. 2 riders came tearing up the trail at a full gallop. The first one was Reverend Elijah Pope, his one good arm holding the reins tight, his coat flapping behind him. The second was a man Silas had never seen before. He was tall and lean, wearing a long gray coat and a silver star on his chest that was twice as big as the one Sheriff Cross wore. A federal star. Pope pulled his horse to a stop so hard it sprayed snow everywhere. Silas, do not you shoot anybody just yet. I was not planning on it. Yet. The federal man got off his horse with the kind of calm power of a man who had walked into worse spots than this and walked right back out again. He was 50 years old, maybe more, with a face that looked like it was carved out of granite, and eyes that looked at Crane the same way a hawk looks at a rabbit. "Who in the hell are you?" Crane demanded. "United States Marshal James Whittam. And you must be Victor Crane." Whittam pulled a folded document from inside his coat. "I have a federal warrant here for your arrest. The charges include child trafficking across territorial lines, conspiracy to commit forced labor, fraud, and the corruption of territorial officials." All the color drained right out of Crane's face. "That is ridiculous. I have legal papers. Your papers were issued by Judge Cornelius Stark, who was arrested in Casper 2 hours ago on 17 counts of corruption, bribery, and conspiracy." Whittam's voice cut through the cold morning air like a church bell. "Every order Judge Stark has signed in the last 3 years is now under federal review. Every custody transfer, every guardianship, every single piece of paper that has his name on it is worthless." Cross took a shaky step backward. His face had gone pale as a ghost. "I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know about Stark. You did not want to know, Sheriff. And there is a big difference." Whittam turned to face him. "You are not under arrest. Not yet. But you are relieved of your duty until this investigation is over. Hand over your badge." The sheriff's hand was shaking as he unpinned the star from his chest. He held it out without saying a word. Whittam took it and slipped it in his pocket like it was a piece of trash, because to a man like him, it was. A badge did not mean a thing without an honest man behind it. Crane's hired men were already backing their horses up. They had not signed up for a fight with the United States Marshal. One by one, they lowered their rifles. "Crane," Whittam said, "you can come with me peacefully, or you can resist. I would much prefer peacefully, but I will take it either way." Crane's hand twitched toward the inside of his coat. Silas saw it. He knew that move. He had his Colt drawn and aimed before another soul could even blink. "Do not," Silas said, his voice low and steady. Crane's hand froze. He looked at Silas, and for the very first time the mask was completely gone. There was no smile, no charm, no slick and oily lies. There was just a man who had built a life on the suffering of other people and had finally come to the end of his road. "Those children are worthless," Crane snarled. "A stuttering boy, one that cannot speak, a half-breed. You are ruining your own life for damaged goods." Silas just walked forward, slow and steady, each step leaving deep boot prints in the snow. He came to a stop about 2 feet from Crane's horse and tilted his head back to look at the man. "Say that again." "They are damaged." In a flash, Silas grabbed Crane's coat and yanked him clean out of the saddle. The man landed hard in the snow, the impact knocking the wind right out of him. Silas stood over him, his Colt revolver aimed steady at his chest. "Those children are worth more than every last dollar you have ever counted. More than every name you have got in that little black book of yours. More than your papers and your judges and your whole rotten empire." Silas's voice was solid as a rock. His hand did not tremble. "They are mine. And if you ever so much as come near them again, court order or not, badge or not, I will put an end to you. That is not a threat. That is the only promise I have ever made that I am actually looking forward to keeping." Wickham stepped forward. "That is enough, Mallister. I will take it from here." Silas held Crane's gaze for one more long breath. Then he holstered his pistol and took a step back. Wickham's men, 2 deputies who had ridden in behind the marshal, hauled Crane to his feet and slapped him in irons. The hired guns gave up without a fight. Cross stood off to the side without his badge, staring down at the ground. "Marshal Wickham," Pope said, "there is a mining operation 20 miles east of here. Children are being held there in forced labor. I know about it. I have got men riding there as we speak. By noon today, every single child in that mine will be free." "How many?" Silas asked. "Our sources say somewhere between 15 and 20. Some of them are as young as 6. Silas squeezed his eyes shut. 15 to 20 children, down in the dark belly of the earth, working until their little bodies gave out. And Crane had wanted to add 5 more to that number. "The families?" Pope asked. "The ones who sold their children? We are tracking them down. Most of them were pressured or tricked. They will have the chance to get their kids back." Wickham turned his attention to Silas. "Which brings us to your particular situation. 5 children, no blood relation, a guardianship paper from a church that may or may not stand up in a federal court." Silas's hand instinctively went to his coat, to the papers resting against his chest. "Those children are staying right here with me? That is not for you to decide alone. Federal law requires a formal custody hearing. Then give me a hearing. I plan to, but I need to know something first." Wickham took a step closer and lowered his voice. "Those kids, do they want to stay with you? Not because they are scared, or because they feel they have nowhere else to go. Because they choose to. Ask them yourself." Wickham looked over at the cabin. The door was ajar. Hannah stood in the doorway. Behind her, 4 small faces peeked out. Wickham walked toward them, and Silas watched as the big lawman knelt down and spoke to each child with a gentleness that seemed out of place on his granite-hard face. He spoke to Clara first. "What is your name, sweetheart?" "Clara May Dawson. And this here is Rosie." "Hello, Rosie." "Clara, do you know why I am here? You are here to help us." "That is right. Can you tell me, do you want to stay here with Mr. Mallister?" Clara looked at Wickham like he had just asked the silliest question in the whole world. "He is not Mr. Mallister. He is Pa." Wickham's eyebrows shot up. He turned to Sam. "And what about you?" Sam's jaw set tight. The stutter tried to take hold, but he fought his way through it. "Silas taught me how to shoot, taught me how to brush down a horse, taught me that being scared does not mean you are weak." He stopped, taking a deep breath. "He is the first man who ever looked at me and did not see something that was broken. Do you want to stay?" "I want to stay." Wickham moved on to Joe. The boy stood apart from the others as he always did, with his knife at his belt and his shoulders squared. "Josiah Whitfield." "Joe?" "Joe. You are not related to the Dawson children by blood?" "No, sir." "And you are not related to Mr. Mallister?" "No, sir." "So why are you here?" Joe was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice so clear it could cut the cold air like his mother's knife through thick leather. "Because my mother was Cheyenne, and the Cheyenne do not define family by blood. They define it by who stands with you when the storm hits. Silas stood with us, all of us. When he had every reason in the world to just ride on by, he stopped. When he had every reason to give us up, he fought. My mother would say that makes him family. Joe touched the bone handle of his knife, and my mother was never wrong. Wickham just stared at the boy. Then he gave a slow nod and turned to the bed where Nettie lay. Hannah was sitting right beside her sister, her hand resting on Nettie's shoulder. "This is Nettie," Hannah said. "She does not speak, has not said a word since our mother passed away." Wickham crouched down next to the bed. "Hello, Nettie." Nettie just looked at him. Those gray eyes of hers were still and deep as a well. She did not move, did not even blink. It felt like the whole cabin was holding its breath. Then, slowly, Nettie raised her hand. She pointed right at Silas, who was standing in the doorway, and then she pressed her palm flat against her own chest, right over her heart. Wickham looked over at Silas. "What does that mean?" "That means I love you," Hannah whispered. "It is what our mama taught her. It is the only way she talks." Wickham stood up straight. He rubbed his face with both of his hands. And for just a second, the federal marshal looked like a man who was fighting with all his might to keep himself together. He cleared his throat. "And you, Miss Dawson?" "Hannah?" Hannah stood up. She seemed taller than Wickham had expected. Or maybe she just held herself that way. She looked that marshal right in the eye with a gaze that had seen too much since Missouri, and was only now starting to remember what it felt like to be young. "A week ago I had a knife, 4 people to protect, and not a single soul in this world I could trust. Now I have got a knife, 4 people to protect, and a man who took a bullet for me before I even had to ask him to." She fell silent. Wickham walked back over to Silas. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and a pen from his vest. "I am going to recommend full legal custody to the federal court. My report will include statements from all 5 of the children, testimony from Reverend Pope, Margaret Holloway, and Thomas Kincaid, and all the evidence of Victor Crane's criminal operation. With the circumstances being what they are, I expect the judge will approve it within 30 days. 30 days. Paperwork takes time, but in the meantime, those children stay right here with you under federal protective custody, with me as the authorizing officer." Wickham signed the paper and handed it to Silas. "Congratulations, Mr. Mallister. You are a father." Silas took the paper. His hand was shaking. He folded it with care and placed it in his coat, right beside Pope's guardianship document. 2 pieces of paper, 2 promises written down in ink instead of just spoken into the air. Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, son, you have gone and done it. I have not done anything yet. Still got a cabin that is too small, $4 that is already spent, and 5 kids who need a whole lot more than I know how to give." "That is what neighbors are for," Tom grinned, and the smile took 10 years off his face. "Besides, I have been meaning to tell you. Mary Elizabeth, my late wife, she left a trust at the bank down in Casper. It is not much, but it is enough. She always said it was for children. We never had any of our own. I think she would say these 5 qualify just fine." "Tom, I cannot take your money. It is not my money. It is Mary's. And it is Mary's wish. Are you really going to argue with a dead woman?" "I would not dare." Maggie arrived an hour later with a wagon packed full of supplies, more food, clothes in all sorts of sizes, and fabric for curtains and blankets, and a rocking chair. "Every home needs a rocking chair," she announced, "for reading stories." "Nobody reads stories around here," Silas said. "They do now." Maggie pulled a stack of books out from under the wagon seat. "Rebecca Thorne over at the schoolhouse is starting up a children's class next month. I have already signed up all 5 of them. You enrolled my kids in school?" "Somebody had to." Maggie put her hands on her hips. "Silas Mallister, you are a good man and a brave man, but you cannot raise 5 children on nothing but venison and lessons in gunfighting. They need books. They need arithmetic. They need to learn something other than just how to survive. They need to learn how to live," Hannah said from the doorway. And she was smiling, a small, cautious smile that looked like it was ready to vanish at the first sign of trouble. But it was there, a real smile on a face that had forgotten how to make one. They spent the next few weeks rebuilding. Tom and Silas added 2 new rooms to the cabin. Sam hauled lumber and hammered nails with hands that never shook, even when his voice did. Joe mapped out the property lines and built a new fence for the cattle with the quiet focus of someone who understood that land meant safety. Hannah organized everything from the meals to the supplies to the daily chores, because 12 years of being a mother had taught her skills that most grown-ups never learn. Clara decorated. She hung bunches of dried flowers in every window and put Rosie up on a shelf where the doll could watch over the whole cabin. Rosie is the guardian, Clara explained. She watches when everyone else is asleep. What does Rosie see? Silas asked. She sees a family and Nettie. Nettie healed slowly the way that really deep wounds do. She still did not speak, but she found her own ways to communicate. She would press her hand to her heart when Silas tucked her in at night. She would press it to her heart when Hannah braided her hair. She would press it to her heart when Sam made her laugh by crossing his eyes. And yes, she laughed. It was a silent kind of laughter, her whole body shaking with it, her face completely transformed. Doc Harlan from Elk Creek came out to check on her. Physically, she is fine. A strong girl. The silence is from grief. It will break when she is good and ready. Could be months, could be years. Just do not push it. Silas did not push it. He just made sure that every single night when he checked on each child, he stopped at Nettie's bed and pressed his own hand to his chest, and every single night she pressed hers back. Their conversation was wordless, and it was complete. Spring came the way it always did in Wyoming, sudden and fierce. The snow melted, the creeks swelled up, the valley turned so green so fast it almost hurt your eyes to look at it. Silas stood on the porch of his newly expanded cabin and watched his children, spread out across the property like seeds that were finally taking root. Sam was in the corral, working with a new colt Tom had given him. His stutter had calmed down. It was not gone, but it was quieter. He still had to fight for his words sometimes, but he had learned that his hands could say what his mouth could not. And the horses, they understood him just fine. Joe was up on the ridge above the cabin, sitting cross-legged in the grass, just watching the valley the same way his mother's people had watched this very land for 1,000 years. He had started teaching Clara a few Cheyenne words, and Clara had started teaching them to Rosie. So now the doll was apparently bilingual. Hannah was inside, sitting at the kitchen table and reading one of the books Maggie had brought. She still had that knife at her side, and she probably always would, but her shoulders were not so tense anymore. Her jaw was not clenched so tight. And just yesterday, Silas had heard her laugh at something Sam said. It was a real laugh, unguarded and completely free, and the sound of it nearly knocked him clean off his feet. Clara was sitting on the porch steps with Nettie, brushing the little girl's hair while Rosie supervised from her lap. 100 strokes, Clara said softly. Mama always said 100 strokes makes it shine like a new penny. Nettie sat perfectly still, just letting herself be taken care of. Her eyes were closed. Her face looked peaceful. And then, so quietly that Silas almost did not catch it, she spoke. Mama. Just one word, barely more than a whisper. But Clara heard it and froze right where she was. Hannah heard it through the open window and suddenly appeared in the doorway. Sam looked up from the corral. Joe stood up on the ridge. Everybody stopped. Everything stopped. The entire world seemed to hold its breath for a 4-year-old girl who had been silent for months of her life to fear and had just remembered how to speak her mind. Nettie, Clara's voice trembled. Did you just... Nettie opened her eyes wide. She looked at Clara, then at Hannah. Then her eyes found Silas. Her little hand came up and pressed flat against her own chest. Then she pointed at all of them, every single one. A slow sweep of her little finger that took in the cabin, the porch, the corral, the ridge, the whole valley, everything. Family, Nettie said. Hannah dropped right to her knees and pulled her little sister into her arms. The sound she made was not crying and it was not laughing. but something else entirely that held every broken piece of the last year. And she finally set them down, gently, right there on the ground. Sam scrambled over the corral fence and came running. Joe came down from the ridge faster than a man ought to be able to move. Clara wrapped her arms around both of her sisters, with Rosie squeezed somewhere in the middle. Silas just stood on the porch and watched his children hold on to each other. And something inside of him that had been broken for 6 long years, something he thought was dead and buried out there beside Catherine and Lily, something he had given up on ever feeling again, rose up in his chest like water from a deep, hidden well, and filled up every last empty space. He did not join their embrace. Not just yet. He just stood there and let it happen. Let himself feel the whole thing, the full weight of love and grief and gratitude and terror and joy, all of it mixed together into something that did not have a name, because no single word was big enough to hold it. Then Clara's voice came out from the pile of children. "Pa, you get down on this floor. I am perfectly fine right where I am. Rosie says to get down here." Well, a man cannot argue with Rosie. He dropped to his knees, and 10 small arms pulled him into the circle. The arms of Hannah, and Sam, and Clara, and Joe, and Nettie, all of them little but sure, wrapped tight around his neck. They held on with the kind of power a child gets when she finally finds her voice, refusing to let go of the folks who helped her discover it. "Family," Nettie said one more time, like she was testing the weight of the word, making certain it was real. "That is right," Silas answered her. "Family." Later that evening, he made his way to the 2 graves behind the little house. The wooden crosses were worn by the weather, the wood itself gone soft. He had not come to this spot in months, had not been able to make himself do it. But on this night, with the setting sun painting the mountains in gold and the sound of his new children drifting from the cabin, he finally stood before Catherine and Lily and began to speak. "I found them," he told them. "Or maybe they found me. I'm not entirely sure how it worked. There are 5 of them, each one broken in their own special way. And every one of them is stronger than they will ever know." He stopped for a moment. "I was broken too. You knew that about me. You always did, Catherine. Even before you passed, you knew I would shatter." A breeze stirred the tall grass. Inside the cabin, he heard Clara laugh, and then Sam's voice joined in. It was a stronger voice now. The stutter was just a little stumble now, not the solid wall it used to be, but I managed to put the pieces of myself back together. Not by myself, never by myself. They were the ones who helped, every last one of them. Silas reached out and touched the cross that bore Catherine's name. "I will never stop loving either of you. But my heart has more room now. Room I never knew I possessed. Room for 5 more children." His voice grew thick with feeling. "I surely hope that is all right with you." The wind began to blow a little harder. For a passing second, it felt just like a hand resting on his shoulder. It was light and warm, and then it was gone before he could be certain it was ever there at all. "Thank you," Silas whispered, "for showing me the way to love. I am going to need all the help I can get." He turned and walked back toward the cabin. The door stood open, and the warm light from the fire was spilling out into the twilight. Inside, Tom was in the middle of one of his grand stories about hunting buffalo. Maggie was giving Hannah a hand with supper. Sam was showing Joe a new card trick he had found in a book. Clara was busy brushing Rosie's hair, explaining to Nettie that a doll needs exactly 50 strokes, and not 100 because doll hair is just not the same as people hair. Nettie listened closely, and when Clara was done, she pointed a small finger at the doll and said in a quiet, clear voice, "Pretty." "She really is pretty, is she not?" Clara beamed with pride. "Pretty," Nettie said again. And then, looking straight at Clara, with those gray eyes that had been so empty for so long, now filling up with all the things her silence had locked away, she added one more word, "Sister." Clara just fell apart, crying and hugging Nettie so fiercely that the doll tumbled to the floor. Sam reached down, picked it up, and handed it back. "Be careful." Rosie is fragile. Rosie is tough, Clara said through her tears. Rosie is the toughest one of us all, except for Hannah. Except for Hannah. Silas settled down into his rocking chair. Maggie had brought it from his own cabin. He sat there with his children all around him and his friends nearby, and the fire burning bright while the night came on, soft and cold and still outside. He had faced this winter with only $12, a single horse, and 2 lonely graves. He had since gained 5 children, a whole community, a real purpose, and something he believed was lost to him forever. It was not happiness. That word is too small for it. What he had gained was the deep knowledge that broken things can be put back together, that empty parts of a life can be filled, and that a man who had lost everything can find it all again, not by searching for it, but by simply being still when his horse would not go on down a snowy path. 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. Every single one of them had scars that might never completely fade. Every single one of them was braver than any soldier Silas had ever served with. And every single one was living proof that family is not made from bloodlines or laws or pieces of paper, but from the plain, stubborn, and frightening choice to love another person and to never, ever stop. Clara looked up from her spot on the floor. Pa. Yes. Rosie has a question for you. What does Rosie need to know? She wants to know if this is forever. Silas let his eyes drift to Hannah, who was sharpening her knife by the hearth. He watched Sam practicing that card trick with hands that no longer shook. He saw Joe carving a block of wood into a small horse with his own mother's knife. He looked at Nettie leaning up against Clara, her lips forming silent shapes around the new words she was learning to speak again. He listened to Tom and Maggie laughing about something over in the kitchen, filling the small cabin with the sound of people who had chosen to be there. You tell Rosie that it is forever. A smile spread across Clara's face. Rosie already knew the answer. She just needed to hear you say it out loud. Outside, the very last bit of light left the mountaintops. The stars appeared cold and brilliant in the dark sky. They were the same stars that had kept watch over this valley for 10,000 years. They were the same stars that had watched a man discover 5 lost children in a blizzard and make the only choice that truly mattered. The choice to halt his journey, the choice to remain, the choice to build a family out of nothing more than courage and love. And it was all built on the solid belief that every child, no matter how damaged, no matter how forgotten, no matter what the world had decided to write next to their name, is worth fighting for. And so, in a cabin tucked away in the Wyoming mountains, a man who had been dead to the world for 6 years sat in a rocking chair, surrounded by the 5 souls who had brought him back to life. And he understood, finally and with his whole heart, that this was the reason he had been surviving all along. It was not for the grief, not for the emptiness, not for all those long, dark years of waking up by himself. This right here, this single moment, these children, this family, this was the destination the road was always leading him to. He just had to stop moving long enough to find it. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.